My name, for those who don't know me, is Karunagita. I'm one of the order members around here and have been for about 30, well, I've been involved with the North London Centre for about 30 years. And I am delighted to welcome, I think for the first time to this centre.
No, I've been a couple of times.
You've been a couple of times. Okay, well anyway, I am delighted to welcome Nagabodhi. Welcome to the North London Buddhist Centre. Nagabodhi is here because he has, we've recently published, is the book he wrote, a biography of Sangharakshita, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist Community and Buddhist order, the boy, the monk, the man. And after this session, Nagabodhi is going to be signing copies, so if you'd like to buy a copy, we've got plenty in the bookshop, and Nagabodhi can sign it for you as well. But just as a very brief introduction, so I'm going to be asking Nagabodhi some questions, well, that interest me really from reading the book, which I would highly recommend if you haven't read it. And then I'm going to open up as well to anybody else who'd like to ask questions, either based on the book if you've read it, or based on what he's been saying during the interview, or just based on curiosities that you have about Sangharakshita from things that you know. Really anything, nothing's out of bounds to be asking. But by way of brief introduction, Nagabodhi's been involved with Triratna for almost... well, you've been ordained into the order for nearly 50 years.
A month less, or I think a month less than 50
years. A month less than 50 years. So come January next year. So he was ordained in January 1974. So that's going to be quite a momentous occasion, really. Half a century in the order, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Which also was around the time of the first order convention, I think. And so you were about 25, I think.
I was, yes.
25 when you got involved with Triratna, yes.
A bit younger when I got involved, 25 when I was ordained.
25 when you were ordained. And he has done a huge amount in that 50 years, including setting up Windhorse Publications and leading that, being a teacher, a trustee, a chair, a president of different centres. And also had lived for a while with Sangharakshita and did a tour of India with Sangharakshita in 1982. So he's really incredibly well placed to be writing a biography of Sangharakshita. But I think one of the things also that struck me reading it that makes you incredibly well placed to do it is that you are also a writer. So it reads very well. It's a very engaging, interesting, easy to read, which is obviously also very welcome. So
thanks. And thanks for having me, by the way. And thanks for having me on your Sangha Day.
Yeah, very apt.
I'm honoured.
Good, very apt to have you here. So, I mean, the first sort of question I wanted to ask about was, well, actually just around the sort of the title and cover of the book, but particularly the title. So it's called The Boy, the Monk, the Man. And I was curious about why you chose that title, and particularly why it doesn't have, for example, teacher, founder, guru, other things that you could have put in the title.
Well, and also what I could have put on the title, which is what almost always we had done in the past, was have a picture of Sangharakshita in robes, probably in India. If you look at most of the books of his about him or of his thoughts, you'll see that picture. And I think what I wanted to do with the cover and the title was really stress that yes, he was at different times a teacher, a founder, a monk, and a human being. And what I wanted to track in the book was just the arc of his life, out of which emerged the Buddhist, out of which emerged the renunciant vision that made him become a monk, but then his openness towards the entire Buddhist tradition that meant he flowed seamlessly from being ordained into one particular lineage, traditional lineage of Buddhism, the Theravada lineage, but quite happily then lived for 14 years among Tibetans on the Tibetan, Bhutanese, Sikkimese borders, getting initiations and teachings from those teachers, before then coming to the West to establish a Buddhist movement, but coming to the West not as a monk, but as, in his own way, a Buddhist, introducing as broadly as he could the entire Buddhist tradition, but in a way that might work in the West, and doing so not in the way most teachers who've taught Buddhism in the West have done, as very clearly identified by one of the traditional Eastern lineages, but simply as a Buddhist with an astonishing sort of overview of the entire Buddhist tradition and a mind capable of synthesizing it in a way that suited his practice, but also allowed him to see what it would mean to present Buddhism as a whole, of immediate and accessible relevance to Westerners, because he was a Westerner. He was a particular Westerner, quite a complex Westerner, as it happens, as a person. And so in the title and the cover, I wanted to break away from this idea that here was this man, and his authority rested on being a man in robes, set in India, bringing this Eastern thing to the West. Yes, he was bringing an Eastern thing to the West. That's where Buddhism began. But he would say Buddhism began in the heart and the experience of a human being who happened to be Indian, Nepali. But what he had to say was, and had proved to be relevant throughout the East, and there was no reason, if it could be communicated appropriately, there's no reason why it couldn't naturalize itself in the West as something absolutely immediate and relevant without necessarily feeling at all alien. Eventually, that's the vision, and that was the path he established, not least by not appearing as a monk, briefly for ceremonial occasions, but increasingly just as himself and living as himself.
And that's why I particularly like this photo, which is him being interviewed by the BBC. I can't remember the year, but it just feels that it's capturing a moment, because he's very much started something very much at the forefront of bringing Buddhism to the West, and that getting also sort of media attention as well.
Well, I suppose he was something of a curiosity because he was a Buddhist monk, as setting up shop in a basement in the middle of London. But if you look at the picture, he's also got long hair. You don't immediately think of him as the sort of archetypal monk, but you get the impression looking at the picture. I suppose what I like about that picture is, it was one of the only pictures from that era.
Oh, wow.
Really very, very few pictures of him in that particular moment when he was just back from a return visit to India in 1967 with the idea of starting a new kind of community. But yes, he was definitely in a phase of his life where he was breaking out of being a monk. Something about that setting, which if you see the black and white original, it's quite grimy. It's very much of its age. And you just think, well, here's someone who looks rather odd, interesting. He obviously must have something to say. And by accident, if you look at the picture closely, and this is an absolute fluke, which I noticed months after the book was published, if you look at their feet, you can see they're walking, but the camera's caught his feet, looking as if he's not, which, if you know your Pali Canon, ties in with a great story about one of the Buddhist disciples called Angulimala, who was a mass murderer. But anyway, we don't need to go there.
Thank you very much in that. I mean, it's good, and also you've led into this thing about, he looked different, he was different. I drew out a few of the words that you used to describe him, particularly in that sort of when the man bit. He's come back to England. He's come out of robes, starting the movement. And some of the words I drew out, which would be good to get you to sort of expand on a bit or talk about, is audacious, stubborn, refined, challenging, fresh, extraordinarily mindful, unexpected, and a phrase that I really loved, which was quietly untamed.
Quietly untamed.
So those are all words you've used. It'd be just nice to get you to talk a bit more about that.
Where do I start?
Well, any of those you want. You can't talk about them all. Yeah.
I'll start with the end one, quietly untamed.
Yeah.
It was a polite alternative to the word feral. I did describe him occasionally as being feral, and once in his hearing, and it wasn't he was upset, he was a little bit thrown. What I meant by that is that when you were around him, you knew that he was kind of, if you like, untamed. He just didn't follow the usual tram lines. You know, he had a particularly eccentric childhood. You know, confined to bed for 2 years, and not able to see people in case that kind of excited him too much. Where all he did really was read. And by the time he left his bed, he was kind of much more educated than people of his own age. So never quite got socialized in the normal way. But then, you know, a war then broke out and he was evacuated and then into the army. He had a very strange early childhood, realized or discovered, whatever word you use, at the age of about 15, 16, that he was gay, which was just, again, part of the mix, not that he did anything about it, or one would in those days. But then becoming a Buddhist, which itself is a challenge to one's conditioning of any kind, eccentric or otherwise. And so the man you'd meet, on the one hand, he had this extraordinary quality of refinement, of mindfulness, and yet if you got at all close to him, which you could do by hearing his talks, you know, if you were sensitive to what was being said, or reading his books for that matter, but if you were around him, and, you know, Vajradhaka will know this from, you know, from the early days, you know, that you kind of couldn't shake him off. You know, he may not even appeal to you. He didn't appeal to everyone. You know, I describe how some people found him kingly and marvelous and wonderful. Some people found him quite almost not terribly appealing to look at or to meet, but you couldn't rub him off. He just had a sense. You knew you were with somebody slightly other. So, I mean, I'd use the term a bigger animal sometimes. He had a presence and an implicit challenge, which he embodied. It was obviously based on his practice and that freedom from the kind of, those layers of conditioning which kind of make us predictable, even to ourselves. But you knew that he seemed to operate from another, slightly different order. And, it didn't make him wildly strange and eccentric. If his eccentricities were more to do with the era he came out of, the way he delivered a talk. But no, I mean, he was very solid, very present. But, when you were talking to him, maybe you raised an issue, you always kind of knew that he immediately had a bigger perspective on it than you did. And there was just something about that was just constantly challenging you, not in an aggressive way. You just realized there was more, there was higher to go or deeper to go. It was just there, it was just gentle, but it was absolutely undeniable. So what's that word? Quietly untamed. It's not a bad phrase, but I quite like the word feral, but maybe it had too much of a sense of something maybe a bit more kind of wild. I wouldn't say he was wild, but wild in the sense of being not uncivilized, but just unconditioned with, let's say, a small u. We're not going into the capital U of unconditioned, but just less conditioned than most people, and that was a product of his practice, his study, his insight. But it made him, quite a fascinating and, strange figure, to me, because he could. There was another level, like when you met him, sometimes he'd shake your hand without looking at you. He had these quite strange habits. He had this very classical oratory style. So you would think, oh, he's that. But then, you'd be around him a while and you'd think, no, what is going on there? Yeah. It's one of the phrases.
I like it.
I
yeah,
threw in a couple of the others along the way out of my generosity.
Yeah, it's I mean, actually that sort of leads in well as well, because the other thing that I noted in the book, because you're saying about what it's like when you're in his presence, and obviously you knew him and you traveled with him and you lived with him, so you were in his presence a lot, but you also talk about actually getting quite tongue-tied, you know, at times, or not, in his presence. I wondered if you could say a bit about but also, you know, if you've any sort of personal time that you were with him, you know, maybe when you felt inspired or supported, or, you know, any sort of personal time of interacting.
There was this thing of being sort of awkward around him. You know, he had this quality of mindfulness. You know, I think I do tell the story in the book, but you know, it's absolutely true. You know, having, you know, after lunch, living with him, I made him a cup of tea, and you know, he's sitting there just waiting for his tea, and he might have been talking to somebody, but I gave him the tea, and it was very mindful. I put it down, trying to just mirror his level of mindfulness. I put the tea down very carefully, very, very mindfully, pour a little bit of milk, just the right amount of milk into his cup, and I pick up the teaspoon very mindfully, and I just notice him just looking, his eyes move from the person he's talking to my spoon, just flat over there. And I look down and I'm just about to put the teaspoon into the margarine. And I'd see this as well as experiencing it. You know, sometimes we would have, you know, he would have dinner, he'd be invited to a community, or would invite a team to Padmaloka, say, where we were living, for a meal, and it could be painful. It was partly people. It wasn't because he was the authority figure. In a way, yes, he was the leader, the founder, the teacher. Again, it just was that sort of, people didn't know quite how to be around him, and he sometimes could play the social games, you know, and you could see him doing it, you know, being terribly friendly, terribly solicitous. Other times he just wouldn't. He just let people be themselves and see what happened. But often around him, people found it quite difficult to be themselves in an ordinary way, or in their ordinary way. And you were trying to work out how should I be around him, which, you know, in itself was sometimes a useful koan. Sometimes it just blocked communication. But at other times, you know, I have another memory, you know, where there was an era in our history where, you know, we might come on to this because it occupies the biggest chapter in the book, was when, you know, in our attempt to kind of pioneer a community, a Buddhist community that was neither monastic nor lay, you know, we put a lot of thought, and he put a lot of thought into how do genders mix, how do we do relationships, you know, where does sexuality come into the picture, and so on. And it could be very confusing. And there was a time when, if you were a happy heterosexual, as I was, you could feel like, you know, you were a bit persona non grata, because there was quite a sort of strong groupthink around. Not that you should all be gay, but you shouldn't be doing it at all, whatever it was. I went to see him, you know, sort of in a bit of anguish, because I was quite happily in a relationship, and felt awkward about it. And he was just astonished and just so friendly and useful about, well, you know, what was the real project, which is to just practice metabhavana like we have, and just understand your emotional life, get deeper into emotion, do things that refine emotion. If you want a relationship, you'll have a relationship. If you don't, you'll discover that. You're completely contrary to what the groupthink around him was, you know, which was interesting in itself, but it was, you know, extremely warm, ordinary, supportive. Very much in that situation, he was, you know, even the language we used, you know, because I was quite young and crude, he just echoed that in replying. He wasn't thrown by it. He just, oh yeah, if you do, whatever. And he just sort of, you know, that's one memory that springs to mind as you ask.
Thank you very much. I will come back a bit to some of those issues but before I do that, I wanted to sort of raise another aspect, an aspect that really struck me more. I mean, obviously, reading the book, I knew, I do know the story, if you like.
Yeah.
So but it was still really, but it's still really interesting. And obviously, some things struck me more than others. And one of the things that sort of came out for me, which it was what I think you describe as his good organizational skills.
Yes.
Which and that sort of struck me in a couple of ways. One is that actually that's possibly quite unusual. You've got this person who's synthesized the Dharma, they're a great teacher, they've come back, they're teaching, but actually having a real eye, and mind on how to sort of set up an organization.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you want to say something about that, because but I've got a sort of sub bit to go on to, but do you want to? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think that there were two levels to it. I think one of it was he just discovered that he was a kind of naturally good organizer when he was living in Kalimpong, this little town very close to the Tibetan border, where he was given or had a tiny little hermitage with some land. He surprised himself by organizing it so that the derelict sort of orchard turned into a productive, I think, peach orchard or kind of plums, which he could then sell in order to raise money to live on and fund the work of the vihara. But it surprised him that he found it perfectly natural to work out how you do that and what it would need. And it was just a small example, but I suppose, writ large, when he returns to, he ran the affairs of the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara when he was living there for a while, when he first came over to England. But I think in terms of his organization within Triratna, there was a man who, briefly was probably a bit well known in the Buddhist world, Jack Austin, a particularly eccentric sort of old school Buddhist from out of the sort of 50s. I can remember him describing Sangharakshita as a first-class organizer, as if that was what he'd done. He just organized a movement into existence. But pretty much everything that emerged, the way we for a while set up communities and businesses, and the kind of order we had, the way our centers are all independent, legally autonomous, where all decisions in the movement, mainly, with very few exceptions ever, are made by consensus, within a center team or a team running a business, or, there's just this challenge through this idea that we don't vote. We just keep talking until we understand each other and are willing to join the consensus, even if we're not always happy. But that's a huge challenge, things like that. These sort of, as he watched us cohere, initially, as just happy-go-lucky young social groups, really. Again, I'm looking at Vajradhaka, who was there slightly before me. But, the first communities, the first businesses, the activities of the center, a lot of it was us kind of, almost having fun with it, very inspired as well, wanting to share it, wanting to do it. We were maybe ambitious, we were cocky. And he would watch us. He would watch us, for example, just trying out the idea of some men going off together for a weekend just as men to have a retreat, and then some women setting up a community and thinking, and realizing maybe single sex is the way to go. But often, like in big ways and small, he was often just watching us, thinking through the principles, extrapolating the implications of what we were doing in relation to his understanding of a Dharma life, and putting it together. He knew from the absolute outset that the movement was going to be a community, and although not monastic, he wanted any power, to the extent you have to use that word in an organization, would have to be in the hands of the spiritually committed, in other words, members of the order. He had been in India and in the UK involved in too many Buddhist organizations that were based on the democratic will of a paying membership. And in India, again and again, he'd seen Buddhist institutions being taken over by Hindus, even Bodh Gaya, the birthplace of Buddhism. And so that was very much an organizational sort of premise with which he started. But yeah, as we started doing businesses, he'd visit a team, spend a day or two with them, or invite them to wherever he was living, and between them work out the principles of how did they work together. How do you turn a fairly inexperienced team into a team living a life of right livelihood, and so on and so forth. So it was I wouldn't say it was in one of my early drafts. I wrote a collaboration, and had a conversation with Subhuti, a fairly senior order member, ordained about 50 years ago today, I think, in his case. He challenged the word collaboration. That was kind of giving us a bit too, that was flattering us a bit too much, but it was an interaction, between his insight, his developing ideas of how might Buddhism be done in the West, how might it be lived, and the experiments we were carrying out. Odd material, because most of us are 25-year-old, refugees from the 60s. Well, almost all of us, with very few exceptions. We were the people who took to him, and in a way, also, he didn't plan it, but he just happened to get a bunch of people who didn't come out of university with massive loans. The welfare state was still pretty benevolent. Some of us, came from middle-class families and had a little bit of backing, and so on. So we were obviously ready and available to do this thing. I mean, he could have maybe worked with more mature people, but they weren't available because by then they had families and careers, full-time jobs. We were ready to have an adventure.
I mean, I think that leads in nicely as well, because I think one of the things that also struck me about this sort of, the vision and the organisational capacity was that he stopped teaching regularly in public centres really quite, quite soon. So he did a lot of teaching, attracted you and Vajradhaka and others around, as you say, these people who had capacity, who had time, were able to dedicate themselves fully. And then after a few years, and you were all ordained, his teaching was more like seminars with members of the order, and encouraging you to all go forth and teach. And that's a really, really, I hadn't quite taken in how quickly that had happened, that how
before we were ordained. I mean, in 1973, he went off on a long sabbatical. I mean, it's incredible. If somebody once, later on in our history, had started, say, the North London Centre, and just when it was getting going, and about 20 people were really involved, he'd said, all right, I'm off for a year. Sangharakshita would have given them a good talking to. But here he is. He comes back from India in 1967, establishes, this tiny little movement, a dozen people in a basement in Monmouth Street, and then, that there's a fire there, so the movement, by then of maybe 20 people, is homeless for a year or so, and we then get a centre in Archway, a derelict piano factory or something that we turned into a centre, which is just beginning to take off. And he says, right, I'm off. And whether we were ordained or not, some were, some weren't, started doing the teaching and being there and befriending people. Lovely memory of a good friend, Buddhadasa, who's now in Australia. He's 80. He was ordained same day as Vajradhaka, a couple of years before me. So were you ordained when Bhante went off on his sabbatical by then?
I was already ordained.
Yeah. So there was you, there was Buddhadasa, a couple of others around. One evening at the little centre, some new people were there, and somebody said, "Well, what do these things mean?" And Buddhadasa said, "Well, it means we're members of the order." And the person said, "Well, what does that mean?" He says, "Well, most people take 5 precepts, but we take 10 ethical precepts." I don't know why he chose that. Rather predictably, the person said, "Oh, what are they?" And between the order members in the room, none of them could quite. So that was the material he was working with.
Yeah.
But, you know, by gum, they were willing. We were willing.
And it's been so, you know, that aspect has been so effective, hasn't it? I mean, because actually for a lot of people, and also, I mean, I was talking to a friend about this aspect of it, and it's like, there is a sort of lack of ego in there, because it's not like, well, I'm the teacher,
Oh, God,
and
yeah.
if I stop teaching, you know, I have to keep teaching because I'm the one that does this well.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, you were pretty raw material at
Yes.
the time.
Yeah.
You know, and he was handing that over basically really quickly.
He was, and I mean, there was a handful of people who he particularly, you know, kept close to, and would, you know, he'd read the minutes of any meeting or anything like that, and there were a few people in particular he would choose to kind of pass messages through. So he was very alive and alert to it. But I think, you know, one of the reasons he wrote a sort of he wrote a little letter to those of us who were most involved at the time he went off on that sabbatical, and one of the reasons he gave was that he was whether he was fed up or tired, or he didn't want to just carry on being a bit of Buddhist, like a Buddhist, put a penny in the slot and get an answer out. You know, and that was partly a teaching to us, but I think it was, again, it represented a phase in what he was doing. I mean, I think he was more and more realizing that to be the leader and the teacher and you know, preceptor of this movement, he just had to be the best Buddhist he could be, not just the monk. You know, and not just keep manifesting as the problem solver. Because a lot of, you know, people would go to him. I know on early retreats he'd get a bit fed up by endlessly being asked by people to help them sort out what was going on in their sexual relationships, or like a bit of a problem solver, or just asking him questions about the Dharma, which he'd already written about or given talks about. I think he did want, it was a bit personal. He was still in the business of working out what it meant for him to be a fully committed Buddhist, but not a monk, and doing this job, putting himself under this extraordinary creative pressure, you know, establishing what he already was envisioning as a worldwide Buddhist development. I won't even call it a movement. I mean, it was a complete, in a way, revolution in the entire modern Western perception of what Buddhism was. I mean, it's an incredible, that's where the word audacious comes. But, you know, interestingly, you know, that he just, all he knew was that he could only do what he could do, and he needed to do it as himself, not to be constantly having to trip over people's assumptions about him. You know, so like if he was a monk, people just saw him as a monk and therefore asked him those sorts of questions or behaved in a certain way around him. So I think it was, you know, it was a daring thing to do and a strange thing to do, but I think it was absolutely essential that he did it. And yes, one outcome of it was that by the time he came back from his sabbatical, it might not have been a year, maybe it was 6 months, something like that. You know, a lot of us had kind of made a deeper connection with our practice, and a queue of us waited to ask him, you know, if we could get ordained. You know, we were just ready and wanted to get on with it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And it also, you know, I mean, I think you used the phrase in the book about sort of in that bit of it of leading from behind, you know, that sort of leadership that's, you know, leading from behind. And as you say, completely finger on the pulse of absolutely everything and knowing what's going on. But, you know, and so really leading, but, you know, doing that from, you know, encouraging other people to do things and learning from it.
And as you say, running these seminars through the 70s and into the 80s, I don't know, 150 seminars where 10 people might join him for a long weekend or for 10 days to look at a Buddhist text or a modern Buddhist commentary on Buddhism and just explore, you know, and those because they were pretty, you know, you're spending 4 or 5 hours a day in a room with him, the conversation would flow between the the Dharma issue, the Buddhist teaching in the text, and how are we living it, and how does that relate with what's going on at our Brighton centre, or something going on in our Croydon centre, or and then occasionally, an occasion like a Sangha day, we'd hire a hall, and he'd give some kind of keynote talk, usually feeding back to us. So many of his talks seemed at the time, you could think, well, that's rather obvious. He's just telling us what we are. So often, like talk on the 10 pillars of the FWBO, or the 6 emphases, or these titles like that, where he was kind of feeding back to us what we are. But looking back, it was much more revolutionary than we realized, because we were in it.
Thank you. I want to sort of shift slightly now into sort of one of the sort of more controversial aspects of him, in terms of because you're saying actually he's sort of looking and seeing what's happening, and one of the things that was happening was, oh right, men and women. So it started off with men and women. Everything was mixed, and then quite early on separated out into a sort of men's wing and a women's wing. And I know, because some of them are friends of mine, that some of those early women, that was quite a shock, particularly because quite a lot of the resources were initially in the men's bit of it, but also but just in terms of an evolution of that one of the things that happened was also around attitudes to women, attitudes to families, which is like you were saying, actually, with the sort of relationships thing, there was this whole thing about, oh well, maybe you shouldn't be doing it, and particularly as you were saying, a happy heterosexual, and even more so in the sort of arena of families. And obviously one of the things that came, which you do talk about in the book, is the publication of the book Subhuti wrote, called Women, Men and Angels. There's a chapter of where angels fear to tread, I think you put it. But that, Subhuti was very much writing something that Sangharakshita wanted written and said, as far as I can gather, and he'd said he wanted it as an actual book with an actual cover and an actual spine or whatever. But part of that, one of the things that came out in Women, Men and Angels was this assertion that women had less aptitude biologically to commit to the spiritual path, and that was, then qualified as initially less, but the initially wasn't even in the book. So
I think it was at an early stage in their development. I thought was in the book, but anyway.
It wasn't emphasized. So that was sort of one of the things that and I was around when it happened, and obviously, and later the book was withdrawn, the book was pulped, and Subhuti issued an apology for having written it. But I just wonder with Sangharakshita, where because it's like, even if you apologize for saying, oh, actually that wasn't a clever thing to say, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't think it. It's just, it wasn't a very clever thing, it wasn't a very helpful thing to say. And in fact, I met somebody on retreat last week who was at the time a lecturer in women's studies when that came out, very involved in Triratna, then the FWBO, and left. Because it's just like, this isn't sustainable. And then she'd come back, I don't know, 10, 15 years later. And the word she used was, I found a totally different movement, So we have moved on. But I'm just curious to know what you think, because obviously this is about Sangharakshita, not Subhuti. What did he think? Did he change his mind? And
Well, like I say, as I mentioned, it's one of the longest chapters, if not the longest chapter in the book, is this sort of, it's not a segue, but I sort of look into that era of our communal life, which Sangharakshita sort of presided over. How well informed or not is sometimes unclear. First of all, I suppose there was this idea in his mind of creating an order that was neither monastic nor lay, and if you see that as a background to the whole enterprise, he and we were working out what that meant in relation to things like sexuality, relationships, and so on, and gender. He had assumed at the outset, when he returned to England with knowing he was about to start a movement, he had assumed it would be completely mixed. He thought that's what the West is, that's what it'll be. And the experiments in having single-sex retreats and communities came from us. He and people seemed to enjoy them, and he very quickly jumped onto it and said, "Yeah, maybe this is a way to go." So he definitely backed it, and in a way started to develop not an ideology, principles around it, insights with a small I around it. So in a way, it's quite important to see that as a background. Something else that could be a background that I sort of hint at in the book is that in a short story he wrote about an artist who is creating a fresco where all the young men from the village or town come to help. And then when the women join them, one by one, they couple up and leave the project, eventually leaving the artist alone again. And just possibly there was a sense, he must have written that for a reason. So maybe he was concerned that if our community, where remember we were all young and all devilishly good looking, if all we'd done was couple up unthinkingly in the usual way, it is possible not much would have got off the ground unless there'd been some challenge to those sorts of assumptions. So I think that was part of the story. In relation to women, it's I think well, he obviously had that background as a monk, and so much literature, Buddhist literature, carries with it a burden of an assumption about the preferential status of men in relation to the spiritual life and so on. I don't think, on the basis of the totality of my experience of him, that's what he thought. I do think that much more mildly than stated in Subhuti's book, he recognized or assumed or believed that women were having to deal with certain elements of their psychophysical conditioning that men didn't have. Men had their own, which he was, he could make fun of, be critical of, but in a different way and on a different level to women. It was me who talked to him some months after the publication of the book, by which time it would really cause so much pain, so much difficulty. And I asked him what he'd meant when he'd said at an early stage in their development, and he said, "Oh, by the time a woman's got far enough into the Dharma to be a mitra, which in Triratna language is at a very early stage, she'd be well past that." Which it was news to me that that's where he meant it. And when I talked to sort of senior women, it was news to them. Now, what interests me about that story, and I hinted in the text, is why on earth didn't he say that earlier? If that's what he thought, he genuinely did believe that there were issues that women had to deal with in terms of, the way their emotions might relate to their physical conditioning and so on. If he had that thought, there were other ways he could have talked about it in ways that didn't make pretty much every woman in the order feel like they weren't being taken seriously as practitioners. I mean, it was really deeply, deeply harmful for a period of time. I think, so to move on, another part of the story, I think, because obviously I had to try and work out a narrative around which included my own thoughts about, well, where was he coming from in that era? He'd spent 20 years of his life in India, some of it as a monk, well, in some ways as a kind of monk, but entirely within a traditional Indian world, among whether they were or Tibetan, Nepali or Indian. And then when working among the followers of Dr. Ambedkar down on the plains, the Buddhist converts, again, he was in a very, very traditional world of arranged marriages. And very, very traditional gender-based roles, social roles, family roles, everything. And I think it took him quite a time to get used to the West, the way we did relationships, the way we did gender roles, not least as I think Sanghadevi, I think it was Sanghadevi when I interviewed her, a senior member, woman member of the order, she thought that when Sangharakshita first came back to England in 1964, English society was quite different, and the challenging of traditional women's roles in Western society was at a different stage to where it was at in the sort of mid-70s, when he things really took off, and that Sangharakshita Bhante, as we sometimes call him, never quite got that, or it took him quite a while to get it. So I think there's that, which kind of, it doesn't kind of, in a way, none of this excuses the groupthink that went on around it and the extent to which he could have done more to challenge that. Because a lot of the groupthink around Sangharakshita's thoughts, whatever they were, came out of some rather hearty, hairy men who were rather enjoying, the fact that, yes, there were more of us. I don't know if we had more resources, but, creating Sukhavati in a sense was like the
Sorry, I just nodded, that's why. You did.
It wasn't so much the resources, but in a way, if a project is a resource, like creating the London Buddhist Centre from a burnt out fire station was, although we had mixed work weekends, it was a men's, it was a community of about 25 men living together in a building without windows through the winter, creating this thing, and it was the Star Project. So things like that were going on. I mean, there is another layer which, is spiritual androgyny. Could say a lot about it, but I won't. Where it bears into this question is, he thought men needed to overcome their conditioning, their social conditioning, their sexual conditioning, their emotional conditioning, and sort of break free of that. And he thought that women did too. And I think when it seemed, I can remember that there were a few situations where it seemed that men who were building Sukhavati were getting quite a lot of attention, and the women, people like Damadina, had to create an Amaravati, a women's community in Wanstead. It was a smaller project. So there were things like that going on, but in Sangharakshita's view was that by creating their own communities, their own businesses, this was going to ultimately be much more to the benefit of women overcoming their lack of confidence, their willingness to not take the lead, but to follow men and so on. Whether these were old-fashioned ideas, they were his ideas, that he wanted to see women emerging and taking a lead and being much more confident in their life and in their spiritual life, and did believe that they would probably only be able to do that if they did separate out more from the men. That combined, though, with some of the misogyny around among some of the men, it didn't work well for quite a long time. But if you talk to people like Sanghadevi and Damadina and others, the leading women around at the time, what's interesting is how much support they got individually from Sangharakshita in all their dealings with him. But on the in the social landscape, it was a wonky, probably, maybe as much as 10 years, probably a bit less, it was at its worst for probably 5 or 6 years. And, I tell some of the stories in the book of some of the excesses. It was not a happy time, but I do think that the strength of the women's wing, which I think more women are getting ordained than men these days, it's still too early, but historians they'll have interesting conversations about, for all the pain, was it worth it? Because it did provoke a lot of strong women to really realize their strength and take a lead and create a very, very well-resourced and very effective women's wing of our order.
I'm going to open it up in a minute because I'm just aware of the time. I have actually got other questions, but I'll save them because I just to see if others have questions.
We were in injury time. We didn't start till about 1:45.
We've got till 1 anyway, so if we need it, or maybe a bit before.
Okay.
But so we're okay for time. But I wanted to open up. But I mean, just to sort of on that sort of bit, I think one of the things I've always felt with it is that there, aspects of it was an unfortunate conflating with that fresco type thing, which is actually, if people were, getting married and having babies, it wasn't, I think there was a conflating with that's not good for your spiritual progress, came out of what actually the reality was that's not good for converting a large fire station in East London into a Buddhist centre. That's not good for dedicating, 24 hours a day of your life to building a movement. And that got unfortunately conflated with this isn't as good for your spiritual progress, which is that that in fact two of my responses to Women, Men and Angels, one is I refused to read it because I knew that I would walk if I did, and the other one is that some years later I wrote a book on how to have an effective spiritual practice in the context of raising a family, which is also published by Windhorse, so that was my personal response to it, but it was but
through
also
that era, by the way, I was asking the very few parents who were around, because I was running Windhorse Publications in those days. I was trying to get someone to write that book.
I knew that because when I suggested it, they would bit my hand off and said, "We've been trying to find someone for years." So yes, please. It wasn't difficult to get it published at all. But also the final thing I think that is helpful to draw out on this is because in a way, is to draw out the separation between sort of teacher and man. And I think there's a really nice quote that you've got in the book from Sadhanandi, and this was just to sort of, in a way that lets us off the hook feeling that we have to agree or disagree with some of these attitudes, because it's like, and you've said about Sadhanandi, Sadhanandi is an amazing, wonderful, strong woman who was chair of Adhisthana. I can't remember.
Chair of Adhisthana, before that chair of Taraloka, before that she worked with me in Windhorse Publications.
Fabulous woman. But what she talked about was that she in this separation, she revered and worked closely with a teacher and was prepared to accept and help the grumpy old man. But it was part of saying this thing of sort of separating out, and you talk about it in the book about this amazing sort of synthesis and communication of the Dharma and the vision to setting up a movement from what you've termed, I think, the provisional status of some of his actions and personal opinions, and I think that's sometimes quite a helpful thing to sort of just say, actually, I never have to think that was okay or agree in any way. And I'm still here, I did. And
it's a hard thing to work out because, in India, some of his closest friends were women. Most of the work he did among Dr. Ambedkar's followers was organized by women. It's, it's not that he, it is a puzzle. In the end, though, I just think, like with a lot of things, we have to look at what we've got now. And I have a friend who was around from the earliest days, who once, way back, sort of said to me, sometimes I wonder if he doesn't care who he'd hurt in bringing about his vision. That you could wonder that about him sometimes, because his eyes was on this astonishing prize of naturalizing the Dharma in the modern world. But I don't think, on the testimony, as I say, of many people who were at the forefront, including the women, when you actually talk to him one-to-one about what was going on for you in all that, he was completely available and helpful. So it is a puzzle. There's not an easy answer, and I don't think I hope I haven't portrayed it as if it is an easy answer.
No, I don't think either of us have. Don't worry.